First of all, I feel a little bit like I'm at a cat lovers convention. I'm about to tell you about how great German Shepherds are. So have some sympathy for me. And also, it's been an hour that we've been in here listening to these really interesting talks. And there are muffins that, if you're anything like me, which most of you maybe are, have been calling your name the whole time. So I think anybody who wants to right now, especially while I'm logging in and stuff, take 5 seconds. But get up, get a muffin, stretch. I'd rather you were doing that than snoring. Yeah, good job. And praying for me to either die or finish. So feel free to do that. While you're doing that, I'll tell you a muffin-related joke. 2 muffins are in an oven. One of the muffins says to the other, "Wow, it's hot in here." And the first muffin says, "Holy crap, a talking muffin." Okay, hang on a second. So for the rest of you who are still watching, who you've already gotten your muffins and your soda, number 1, I envy you. Number 2, I'll get started. My name is Scott Menter. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer. Well, I meant quietly. I meant you get your thing quietly. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at BP Logix. We're a BPM platform company in Southern California in the San Diego area, where I'll be rushing back down via our friends at Southwest shortly after the meeting to find that there's also rain down there. So we've managed to have it rain 2 days this year, and today is one of them, apparently. Okay, so marketing slides, there's some customers. And here's some awards. Make sure you write these down. Okay, that was the marketing slides. So let's talk about flowcharts. Flowcharts have treated us all pretty well. We're all here. We're all nicely dressed. This is a nice place. Obviously, the flowcharts have been working out for us. That's great. This is what I call the model so many of us have grown to love, and that we're all familiar with, the bpmN style model. I think it's all bpmN all the time after my talk today. I refer to this as a successor model. So the standard bpmN style or flowchart model, I call a successor model. Why is it a successor model? Well, because the key question at any given point in the process is, where do I go from here? What happens when I complete this step? So you're only in the step as long as you haven't met any of those conditions to complete, right? So, I'm in step 1, nothing happens, and then nothing else happens. So far, I'm really enjoying, there we go, okay. Something happens, and something else happens, and so on. So I'm always concerned with what happens next. It's sort of, if any of you had the misfortune of taking algorithms like I did, I mean, it's pretty standard deterministic finite automaton stuff. You're here, it doesn't matter that much how you got here. What matters is how you're getting out, right? But we started to notice something about this kind of process, and by this kind of process, obviously, I mean almost everything we've ever, any of us have ever built, and that is that a lot of the processes we received just didn't work that way. Which is to say, more often than not, the customers wouldn't say to us, okay, I have a process where this has to happen, and then these things can happen, and this other thing can happen. The process is more like, okay, here's a bunch of things that have to happen, and it doesn't really matter what order. But this one, step 27 can't happen until step 34, or that doesn't make sense, until step 16 is complete. Or step 92 can't really run unless it's a Tuesday and it's at least a week after, step 35 has started, or something like that. More and more processes we were seeing like that, and we found that these were very, very difficult to model using traditional kinds of notation. So what did we do? Well, we thought about it. And when I say we, I'm using the, non-royal we. I had no part in this, but I do like to take credit for other people's work. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is a segment from a nice process that we built for somebody. I think it's a CapEx process or something. And it's just a piece of it. I personally find it hideously ugly. And I think that there's a lot of sort of difficulties that come along with building a process this way, and with something that starts to get this complex and this ugly and has this many arrows and all of that. So one is really complex to build, and I think that's been acknowledged in a couple of talks implicitly today, which is to say, look, these flowcharts that make so much sense to all of us, everyone here in the room, don't make a ton of sense to our business user customers. When I was a CIO, there was no way I could communicate with a business owner, department owner, using the kind of thing that you see in the lightly in the background here. That just didn't work for them. If I asked them for their process, it always came in what? If you ask a business user for a process, what do they give you? They give you a flowchart? What do they give you? Excel, project, right? They give you a list of stuff. Okay, so we're used to these things, like I said. Next thing is, I'm not very good at this. All right, next thing is, I can't look at this thing and decide when it's going to be done. In fact, I don't know how long the whole thing's going to take. I don't know how long it's going to take to get from one place to the other. I don't know if there's a delay in, a corner, the upper left corner somewhere, what effect that's going to have on the lower right corner. So when process owner asks me, well, how can I optimize this thing, or where's the critical path, or where are the various other, kinks in the process, I find it difficult to answer that question. We also noticed that if you had, say you had things that you typically modeled as independent subprocesses. So I'm going to show you in a minute, I'm going to show you, just like one of our earlier speakers, I'm going to show you a new employee onboarding type process. And we're going to say, well, okay, maybe there's a few sub-processes of that, or process segments of that, right? There's the IT, when we get to provisioning, right? There's the IT part of it, there's the HR part of it, there's the facilities part of it. But then what if something in the facilities part depends on something happening in the IT part? Or any one of these other cross dependencies. Those are, again, very, very difficult to model in flowchart style diagram. If we had 2 hours, I'd prove it. Since we don't, take my word for it, and I'll be happy to show any of you what I mean in more detail later. And finally, again, how can I improve this thing? If I don't know how long things take, and maybe I do, like maybe I have individual timings, of course, in my steps, but overall, it's very difficult to look at this, determine, where things are going, how long it's going to take, and so on. Then how can I really improve it? How can I make it more efficient? So we looked at that and said, okay, why don't we build processes the same way that our customers think of them, which is just to list out the tasks. So this is, generic and theoretical, but it's, and is not the product, obviously, but it's here to give you the idea. The idea is we get a list of tasks from our customer. Great. Let's let them just put in that list of tasks the way that they are used to doing it, just as a list. But then we're going to go and we're going to do some things. We're going to say, well, okay, all these things right now, they all look like they're going to start at the same time, right? Losing my trigger finger here. This thing is cool, but I'm not good at it. Oop, oop, oop. It's a little, I'm playing a little bit of like Pac-Man with this thing. Okay, good. So right now, the way this thing is set up, obviously, everything's going to start running at once. Well, for most processes, that's not really what you want. I mean, sometimes be surprised now that we have this how often you do build processes that way, where everything starts at once, but most often that's not the case. So we look at this and we say, okay, well, it turns out maybe task B is really dependent on task A, so I'm going to go ahead and say so. And the system is going to say, oh, well, if B's, can't start until A is finished, then I'm going to move it out there. You guys have all seen something like this in MS Project. But in MS Project, of course, you're not talking about a process model, something that's actually going to execute. That's just a picture, right? MS Project is a picture. This is an executable model. C depends on A, so C is going to move out past A. D depends on B. E depends on C. And F depends on something, on D. So now I have this whole thing that's laid out. And maybe it's, so think about, for example, opening an account in a bank, right? So, well, let me step back. So we call this a predecessor model. Why do we call it a predecessor model? Because what matters is not where you're going next. At no time did I say, well, when this is, after this I have 3 choices. I can go here, here, here. That's not what I said. Each of these was able to start as soon as all the conditions for it required to start were met. So we call it a predecessor model. Everything can run as soon as the conditions required for it to run have been met, which means that when I see like task F, here task F has no preconditions. It will start running immediately as soon as I start this process. But if I say task F depends on task D, well, now that's a condition required for it to start. So it's going to wait for task D to complete before it can start. Does that make sense so far? I wrote a little example in here, but I can't read it. So we're just going to ignore it. And I'm going to show it to you live anyway. Also, by the way, what's the first thing I can see here? Well, clearly I can see how long things are going to take. I can see how long it takes to get from one place to another. I can very, very easily do what you see there, which is critical path analysis. So there's a substantial amount of information that I can get just by looking at it. So again, number one, each activity starts as soon as the preconditions for it have been met, shows me how long the whole process takes to complete, and when I can expect to begin and end various activities within the process. It's easy to see the critical path. And then the last thing that's important to remember about this that I haven't mentioned yet is this isn't a view. This is the actual model. I'm going to show it to you in a moment. But we're not talking about taking a bpmN style process or some other style and viewing it with this kind of model. This is actually how we're building the process. It's a different execution engine, and it has to be because it's working in a fundamentally different way. That's all the slides. So now we're going to see the really cool thing, which is, does Scott know how to use? Da, da, da. And you know, if you still wanted a muffin or something, that'd be okay. Okay, so this is Process Director. I'm not going to show you very much of Process Director, frankly. There's no need to. I'm not going to run through a process. I'm not going to build a form. I'm not going to do any of the cool things I do during a demo. I'm just going to show you a little bit about process timeline, and hopefully somebody's going to signal me if I'm running over or running whatever. So I want to go to an example that we use a lot, and it's convenient because you've seen one already earlier today, and it happens to also be the kind of example that works really well with process timeline. Although again, it illustrates process timeline really well. Most processes actually work pretty well with process timeline. So I have this new hire onboarding process, right? And if I look at it in sort of its most basic essence, the deep soul of the onboarding process, it's really these things, right? I'm going to recruit. Once I find somebody, or I'm going to get a rec approval. Once I find somebody, I'm going to do some recruiting. Once I find somebody, I'm going to hire them and provision them. And then on day one, they have a whole bunch of papers they have to sign disclaiming that anything they've ever thought of belongs to them anymore, and so on. So that's the fundamental of it, and it sort of looks like this, right? Each stage depends on the previous one to complete, so that kind of makes sense in that kind of process. But when I expand it a little further, I can see, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to close some of these to make it a little more clear. This is actually easier to use than the trackpad. That's cool. So I'm going to get rid of onboarding here. All right, so mostly I've still highlighted this provisioning phase. This is what I was talking about earlier. So I've recruited somebody, I've hired them, I've brought them on board. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen. And generally, as you can see, it's falling into sort of three categories. These facilities activities, these IT activities, we're seeing this, right? Good. I just realized I hadn't checked. And HR activities. Again, in theory, if I were building this as a flowchart, I'd build these each as, separate sections of the flowchart or separate sub-processes. I can do sub-processes with these. We also support, obviously, traditional flowchart style workflows as well. But here I'm doing it in a timeline, and that's giving me a few benefits. So one of them is, again, just this ability. I can see how long things are going to take. I can look and see what the dependencies are. So for example, if I'm going to set up an email account, that is going to wait until add user to Active Directory is complete. Well, that makes sense. He needs to have a AD account before we can set up an email account. But then a whole bunch of other things are dependent on set up email account to complete. So grant VPN access, HR activities, order business cards. I know from sitting out there that isn't as easy to read from there as it is from here, but you can take my word for it, or I'll show you later. And I don't have a Mac, so I don't have the cool Zoom feature that was noted yesterday. So I have all of these activities that are dependent on setup email account. Now notice that setup email account is sitting in the IT activities section of this onboarding process. But these other activities, they're in completely different sections, but I'm able to create these cross dependencies in a way that doesn't cause me to have to create a big spaghetti diagram on the page. I'm just listing out what I need, and I'm just saying what it depends on. The product is making the Gantt chart and figuring out, where things are going to fall and where things are going to lie. I might want to look at the history of this particular process, and this is a demo process, so it's kind of abused. So I might look at an analysis of this. So now these gray bars that you see underneath here, the gray and white bars, the gray bars are the critical path. The gray and white bars are the original definition, or what we call the plan for the process, and then the little doohickeys, I forget what I call them, the sawhorses, they're superimposed on top of those are the actual experiential sort of aggregated experience running this process. I always say that process timelines, which is this patented technology, that's what we call it, process timelines are like people in that they gain wisdom through experience, right? So the more often you run through this process, the less weight we give to your original plan in terms of predicting when things happen, and the more weight we give to actual process behavior in the past. Which reminds me that now that you're looking at this, you can see there's something interesting happens here, which is I'm looking at this, I have this laid out, I know what all the dependencies are, I know what has to happen before anything else can happen, I have a complete view of this. I can now do something interesting. I can predict future behavior of the process. This is really, really important in a lot of situations. I'm going to give you a couple, but let me explain how it works. What I'm going to do is I'm constantly going to evaluate this history of the process against where I am. So this is the definition, but if I'm in a running process, and I'll show you this in a moment if I have one. If I'm in a running process, it's going to show me where I am, what's happened until now. Based on that, based on the aggregate history of execution of this, I'm going to be able to predict, even for activities, even for steps that aren't scheduled to begin until much later in the process, I'm going to be able to raise my hand and say, that activity 97 that's not actually scheduled to begin until September, yeah, that looks like it's going to be late. That can be extremely valuable. That means the earliest possible notice that something might go awry. It means the earliest possible opportunity for intervention, whether manual or otherwise or automatic, based on that information. I'll give you an example. Starwood Hotels has a process that runs for a year and a half where they roll out their revenue management technology to their various sites, and they have thousands or hundreds of these hotels all over the world, right? Starwood's like Sheraton and St. Regis and a bunch of others. So they're constantly in the process of rolling out new technology to all their sites. This thing takes 12 to 18 months to do for whatever reason from beginning to end. And they try to do it in such a way that if there's a part of this process where somebody has to fly to the site and do some installations. So, you'd really like to do it so that the guy goes to, Shanghai and Hong Kong and Tokyo on the same trip and not say, Shanghai, London, Boston, Tokyo, Los Angeles, because that seems like a pain. And so they set these things up to do that, and they want to know pretty early. They want pretty good notice if that person, if they're not likely to be ready for that person to show up in Shanghai on the day that he's scheduled to show up. So actually, when they started implementing this process, they went with what they were familiar with, the sort of flowchart style, the traditional flowchart style model of the process. But as soon as they started learning more about process timeline, they actually threw out everything they'd done, re-implemented it as process timeline so they could get the benefit of that predictive behavior as a big time saver for them. We're seeing a lot more of that kind of thing. If I have a running instance of this process, and I think I do, I can show you how this plays out in real time. So here's a couple of running instances. Here's one I started last night, I think. And I'm going to go look. I have a few ways to look at this thing. Most of them are just product demo and not actually what I'm trying to show you. So good. So this is an interesting view because I started this last night. In my plan for this process, I only had a very short time for, you can see requisition approval was due by 4 p.m. yesterday. So the little, sorry about that, the little triangle shows the due date. It was due by 4 p.m. yesterday, but based on history and based on where we are now, which is obviously well beyond that, it's saying, okay, well, that clearly didn't happen. And notice how everything else is pushed off to the right. Yeah, we figured out that these other things are going to be delayed. This is a pretty simple example because obviously in this particular process, everything else depends on that first step to complete. If it didn't, then you'd see some of them to the left, you know, some of them in blue still and the others in amber or red. So all the rest of these are already late. And we're going to find out if something interesting, if I have the dexterity to do this with this thing. If I say, no, probably not. I'm going to have to wrap up. Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if this was a 5-minute talk or a 55-minute talk. Apparently, with the muffins, it was more. So there's a lot more I can show you. So the bottom line that I wanted to communicate is there are other ways to look at processes. We're all very familiar and comfortable with one way. This is another way. This is a way that we found addresses a whole set of issues that flowcharts have had trouble identifying. There's a lovely paper by Denny on that if you haven't read it, on time in BPM, and a separate paper on time in bpmN. I think there's a reason time hasn't worked its way into bpmN. It doesn't fit well. It fits well in this kind of model. So I'm happy to talk to anybody more about this. I have to leave early. Unfortunately, my marketing department demanded my return, but please drop me an email or anything if you don't see me today. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.